2, 1, live.
Hi everyone and welcome to the next episode of PHP Release Radar, this time with Matthieu Napoli about Bref. And this is a very special episode because it's about serverless, and that's a very, very new technology for most of PHP developers, I would say. But before we start about that, quick introduction about the chat. So you can use the chat to ask questions while we are live, and we will try to ask them directly. And at the beginning, Matthieu will start and tell us, who are you, Matthieu, and how did you start PHP?
Right. So hi everyone, thank you for having me tonight. Hi everyone in the chat looking at this live, or if you're watching the replay. I'm a developer. At the moment, I do projects, consulting work. I work mostly with PHP. That's why we'll be talking about PHP and Bref today. Um, I've been working in the web and doing web development for more than 10 years now. And I've done most of that with PHP, so I really love the language. Um, I've been also using Java, lately TypeScript and JavaScript. Really enjoying those as well. But yeah, mostly PHP most of my career, if I can say.
So, so when you say you started 10 years ago, serverless wasn't around then, right?
No,
So it was
it
something
wasn't.
you,
Even though you had like shared hosting
yeah.
where you could just drop your code and it was working. So in a sense, there was some way you could do some serverless stuff before it even existed.
Yeah, and you had some kind of a Plesk interface where you configure
Yep.
PHP or something. Yeah,
Yeah.
maybe that's
Those were the days.
yeah, yeah. But how did you start to adopt serverless? I think Bref is around 3 years old or something. And
3, maybe 4 soon. I'm not even sure. So yeah, how it started,
yes,
right? So let's say 3 4 years ago, I was working with PHP, running that online, and I I was kind of fed up with how many servers I had to maintain for my side projects. It wasn't much. Like you have a server, you set up Apache and Nginx, and you have to set up PHP and whatever. And it works kind of, but then you have problems, and you have to set up HTTPS certificates, and it was really annoying. And those were just for my side projects. At work, we were looking into containers and virtual machines, and even at the end, like Kubernetes. And I mean, it's very fine. Those technologies are really, really great. But for some projects and small websites, it's way too much. And I just stumbled upon AWS Lambda at the time, and I was really surprised by its concept, by the way it worked, and the simplicity. I mean, the theory behind it, where you could just take your code, put it online, and it was running. So um, that's the aspect where you could just put code online without any technical fiddling was really, really interesting.
okay. So you mentioned AWS Lambda, and
Mhm.
it solved the problem of maintaining a lot of servers. So what is it, and how does it solve the problem for you?
Right. So AWS Lambda, for those who don't know about that, this is a service from AWS, but you can find the same thing at Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud, and other cloud providers. And the name for that, the general name is function as a service. So function as a service is a way to upload code to the cloud provider, and they will run that code for you when there's like an HTTP request or there's a job to process, anything. So function as a service is a way to make your code serverless. So serverless is a very wide term that describes a lot of things. Like if you know about Amazon S3, which is a file storage in the cloud, this is serverless. Function as a service and AWS Lambda, this is serverless too. You can also use, I don't know, for search, if you know about Elasticsearch, you could also use Algolia, which is a cloud service, and Algolia is serverless as well. And you have many services like that that you can use to be serverless. So yeah, I hope that answers the question. I really try to make this distinction between, okay, there's serverless in general, and if you want to run code, you can use function as a service, and more specifically AWS Lambda if you want to use AWS.
But when the term serverless suggests that you don't have a server at all, so but the
Right.
main meaning is that you don't have to care about the server, right?
That's a very good point. It confuses many people that are there servers in serverless? Yes, there are, absolutely. I think that's a very valid question, even though it's sometimes used to joke around. It's more like you don't manage the server. You care less about the servers. And if you upload your if you use Amazon S3, you don't really care about the file system and the hard drive. You just
Yeah.
use Amazon S3 and you send your files. And it's the same with AWS Lambda. You send your code and it runs, and you don't really care the technical details of the virtual machines or the actual hardware that runs it. You don't even care how it runs because it scales for you automatically, and there are many details like that you don't have to deal about.
So, but when you say that you had a lot of servers for your side projects and AWS Lambda solved the issue for you to maintain them, how is the transition? So, how does it work for you to bring your side projects to a serverless Lambda function?
So if we're talking about the first time I used it, it was really, really, really weird. Because that's how I got started with Lambda and serverless. I I was with the servers, and then I was Lambda, where I could just upload some code, and only it was really cheap because I would only pay for whenever my code is running, and I wouldn't have to worry about having a server running all the time. It was just, if there's a request, my code will run and respond to the request. So for my side projects, it was perfect because it was a bit like shared hosting. I would have really small projects, I put them on Lambda, and they cost very little. But then over time, I realized that, yeah, it's good for side projects, but what about larger projects? What good is it for larger projects? And that's where the scaling part becomes really, really interesting. Now, if we are talking, you asked about how it runs specifically. So I could go into the details of how to have PHP run on Lambda if you want to. Is that
I think it's more about the use case. So if I have a
okay?
website and
Right.
I want to delegate something to Lambda, so
Yeah.
what is
Okay, I
sensible
see.
to do?
Yeah, I see what you mean then. I was thinking about something else. Okay, so if you've had a look at Lambda, you may have seen that on Lambda you upload code that responds to events, and AWS Lambda in itself is very limited. But you can combine services like cloud services in AWS, but it's the same in other cloud providers. You can combine services to build a website. So if I want to build a website, I will have API gateway, which is a cloud service, and I will connect that with AWS Lambda. And those things combined will have my application respond to HTTP requests. So API gateway will basically create a public URL for my website, and my code will run on Lambda. And that setup is very similar to what you have on a server. On a server, you have Nginx, which takes the HTTP request, or Apache, and Apache or Nginx forwards that to PHP, which is, for example, PHP FPM, the PHP FPM process running on the server. And so we can get the same kind of architecture, but without those web servers, those daemons running, but instead having cloud services. So that's a way to run websites, but you can use Lambda to do many different things. As I said, Lambda is very generic. So you can, for example, you can have websites, but you can have queue workers. If you had jobs, you can set up Lambda to be triggered not by API gateway, but by Amazon SQS, which is a queue service, like RabbitMQ is.
Mhm.
If you wanted to do file processing, like let's say you upload a video, and then whenever the video is uploaded, you want to process it, then you could do the same thing. You upload your code to Lambda, and what will trigger it is no longer API gateway or not SQS, but Amazon S3, because Amazon S3 is able to trigger Amazon Lambda. And so the serverless approach is thinking about those blocks that you can tie together with events, and then you write code that responds to those events.
Okay, so I think it's quite different to think in those building blocks, right? When you come from a very traditional way of building PHP websites, it might be hard to switch or
Yes. Yes, the way I'm saying that right now, I think yes, but I think you have kind of two approaches. If you are in a large development team and you are already deep into microservices and you want to have the architecture set up in the way you want it, then you can play Lego with those blocks, right? But that's indeed a bit more complex. If you are building a website, if you are just wanting to process uploaded avatars on S3, if you want to just have a simple queue setup, what I suggest is to follow, classic patterns. And there are classic patterns, like I mentioned, API Gateway plus Lambda. It sounds complex, but you just have to use the standard pattern of API Gateway plus Lambda, and then it works. Just like you have to know about using Apache and PHP. If you follow those standard patterns, there aren't many of them. There's like API Gateway and Lambda for websites and APIs. Then there are queue workers, and then you have like file processing on S3, and maybe 2 or 3 more, and that's about it. So you can focus on those established patterns if you want to get started with a classic use case.
So it sounds like Lambda is very flexible in kind of how you can use it. So you mentioned it could be a worker, you can connect it to S3, and you can use it directly after an API gateway. But you also mentioned that there are limitations. So I think
Yes.
it's very important if you design an application and using a Lambda or a serverless approach that you know about the limitations upfront, right? So what kind of limitations are there?
So the first main limitation you will see, if you are using PHP, if you are using Bref, and we will get into Bref and how it works. But if you are using Bref, you don't have much to change in your code base, except for one important thing, the file system. Because on Lambda, the file system is read-only. And at first, for me, that sounded really weird, and I thought that was a weird limitation, but it's actually a very good practice. If you're doing container-based deployments already in your microservices, you are probably already doing read-only file systems. The reason for that, first, you know that you are deploying a code base that will never change for as long as it's deployed. If you want to change it, you have to deploy again. So you don't go and edit the production code, code in production. You just deploy new versions, and you know that whatever is deployed will not change, and you can follow like bugs more easily like this. So this is a good thing. And the second reason is for security. You don't, on Lambda, since the file system is read-only, your code will never change. So you can't get an injection of code where the attacker will change the PHP code to inject bad code in there. Just like you hear so many times in WordPress plugins, that's still that's a security vulnerability that exists. So you get rid of that. It's not protecting you of everything, but it's a very good first step. So I would say for this limitation, if you're using a traditional framework like Symfony, like Laravel, most of those frameworks are already flexible enough to let you, like with a bit of configuration, you can say, okay, instead of storing stuff on the file system, I will use something else. So if it's a cache, maybe I will use Redis, right? If it's or I can store it in memory, maybe. If it's important data, I will maybe put it in Amazon S3 or in the database. Like for sessions, you can use the database as well. File system is the first one. And yeah, if you use Laravel Symfony, that's fairly easy usually. But if you have a large legacy application, yeah, I think Lambda is not the best fit for your application, because you may have to rewrite too much stuff. What do we have? Main change as well is that instead of paying for a server or several servers, and you know how much you're going to pay every month, you go from a billing that depends on how much traffic you get. So it's pay per use, which is great because most of the time it's cheaper using Lambda than using a server. But there's still this unknown, and some people are uncomfortable with it because what if I get a huge traffic spike? So that's one. It's not really a limitation, but that's one thing that you have to keep in mind if you're going serverless. Um, and finally, there's one as well, which is people talk a lot about that. So you may have heard about it. It's called a cold start.
Mm-hmm.
And a cold start is that for some requests, so maybe it's too early to go into the details, I'm not sure, you tell me, but for some requests, the request will be slow. Like the first request, when you haven't had a traffic for a long time, and first request will be slow because like servers behind, not really servers, but containers or stuff running your code will reactivate. And when I say slow, it's like from 200 milliseconds, or maybe sometimes it's 1 second, sometimes it's even 2 seconds for very, very large applications. So if you have a website with traffic all day, all night, you won't see many of them. But if you have a website that sometimes has no traffic, and maybe in the morning many people connect to the application, that could be something that you can notice. Usually, in practice, this isn't really a problem. But when you read about it, you feel like it's a problem. But in practice, many people have talked about it. They don't even see that. They don't even notice in production, because when you run on the server, you already have like less than 1% of the requests that maybe were slow because for some reason somewhere something was slow, and that happens. As long as it's very rare, that's okay.
So it's you mentioned that scaling is a good that's a benefit of using Lambda, is that you can scale very easily. So I would imagine that there are some, if you have traffic, there are a couple of machines or containers running already to serve your requests, and then there is a peak of usage. So I would think that AWS has to spin up even more containers and more containers. So is it something that has an influence? So the cold start happens there as well, or is there some mechanism to?
Yep. So imagine I'm building a website, and I'm selling. I'm taking an extreme example. I'm selling concert tickets, and at 9 p.m. I will open the sales, and everybody's waiting for that sale. They have a reminder, they have push notifications and emails and whatever. And so at 9 p.m. I send notifications everywhere, and so many people come onto the website to buy the concert ticket. So in AWS Lambda, our code will run in containers. Like I'm saying containers, it's not exactly the Docker technology, but it's similar. Okay. So my website is running maybe on 1 or 2 containers because there is not so much traffic, and then everyone comes at once on the website. And Lambda automatically will scale, and by that I mean it will add new containers to handle the additional traffic. And maybe I will scale from 1 or 2 containers to 10 or 100 containers. And that's the beauty of Lambda. I can scale to 1,000 containers or even more if I configure it to allow it to grow like 10,000 containers. But every new container will have a cold start. There may be like 200 milliseconds of delay for the first request on each container, just for the time for the container to boot. So yeah, those people that want to buy the concert ticket, they maybe will have a slower request, some people in there. And maybe that's a lot of people, because I have 1,000 containers booting, so that's 1,000 requests that will be slow. But I like to compare that to the alternative, which is I have servers. And suddenly I have 100,000 people on my website. So either I have a lot of servers and I'm paying a lot of money, or my server has a risk of crashing or being very, very slow because the CPU will be overloaded, the RAM will be full, or whatever. That's a possibility. So the question is, do you prefer that the worst case scenario is 200 milliseconds for some people, or maybe 1 second, or the worst case scenario could be that the site is crashing at the worst time? So that's the way I like to think about it. So that's why I'm saying it's not that big of a deal. if you have a huge traffic, at least you know that you can handle it.
Sounds very reasonable. And I was thinking, so AWS Lambda on the one hand side, and you mentioned that even a Symfony project or a Laravel project is able to run in some kind of a serverless function. How does
Yeah.
Bref come in to enable this?
Right. So the beautiful thing with AWS Lambda is that it does not support PHP, at least not natively. And I'm being ironic here, yes. Um, but that's okay. So the idea with Bref is that it provides PHP support on Lambda. And it does that through a system called custom runtime. So on Lambda, it's not running Docker containers, even though there was a new feature in December. You can now run containers in Lambda. But let's put that aside for a moment. If you want, you can run containers in Lambda, but you don't really have to. You can use natively supported languages are, for example, JavaScript, Python, Go, Node. Yeah, Node is JavaScript anyway. And you can use a custom runtime that you can build yourself. So you can build a runtime for PHP. If you don't want to build that, which is kind of hard to be honest, you can use Bref, and Bref provides that runtime. And actually, if we go into the details, so that's really important to understand that if you're listening, you have two runtimes in Bref. One is the PHP runtime, just like if AWS was building it. So you are building Lambda functions, just like in Go and Node and Python. And if you don't understand, and so with that runtime, you can handle Lambda events. And if you don't know what that means, I understand, and that's okay. You don't have to use this one. This one is advanced. This one is useful if you want to build microservices and Lambda functions and you know what Lambda is about. If you don't, that's okay. There's a second runtime. And that second runtime is simpler for PHP developers out there. The second runtime runs PHP FPM inside Lambda. And actually, you don't even need to care about that. That second runtime runs your framework and your PHP application on Lambda just like it runs on any server. So I really like that second runtime. It's not like the AWS way, and it's not I don't know how to say that. I don't think AWS would approve, but it works really, really well. And you can take Laravel or Symfony and put it on Lambda and say to Bref, okay, send all HTTP requests to index.php, and that's it. It works just like with Nginx and PHP FPM on a server. So you have to choose between those two runtimes, and I really advise people that start to go with the one where you are running PHP in a familiar environment.
So the PHP FPM layer just connects to my application like in the web server, and Bref is the middleman between the PHP FPM layer to Lambda, or how does it work?
How does it work? It's really interesting. I mean, in my opinion, and so if you use Lambda without Bref, without PHP FPM, the way it works is that you write functions, like actual code functions. That's why it's called function as a service. So let's say I'm writing a JavaScript function. I write my function, and I write a function, and the argument that I get is called an event. And that event is provided by Lambda, and it contains information of whatever triggered my function. So if I connect Lambda with API Gateway, like I mentioned earlier, API Gateway provides a URL. So whenever there's a request on my URL, like my website, my function of code runs, and the event variable, the event parameter, contains information about the request. And I can run whatever I want and return a response. So that's great, but that event variable, it's not a standard HTTP request. It's a format that is specific to AWS. So if I want to use that, that's fine. That's perfectly fine. But Symfony doesn't understand that, and Laravel too. In PHP, there are standards way to have HTTP requests. So what Bref does is that it takes the event variable and it turns it into a request that PHP understands. So specifically, if we are getting technical, it turns it into a fast CGI request. Fast CGI is a protocol that PHP talks, and actually PHP FPM talks. So whenever you're running Apache or Nginx with PHP FPM on a server, between the two you have a fast CGI connection, and Apache or Nginx is sending fast CGI requests to PHP. And PHP doesn't talk HTTP. That's Apache or Nginx that talks the HTTP language. So that connection there, I'm just using that in Bref to make it so that the PHP script and application runs just like on any server. For them, they're getting a fast CGI request, and it's exactly like on any server.
To recap, the HTTP request is coming into the API gateway.
Yep.
The API gateway forwards it to the Lambda as an event.
Yep.
And the event is turned by Bref into the fast CGI request, right?
Yep.
And then the PHP server API takes over and hands it over to Laravel or Symfony or something native.
And actually, in there you get the request in $get, $post,
yes.
Just like in legacy PHP. And those frameworks will actually turn those global variables into objects.
Yeah.
So that's funny because you have the same HTTP request turned into several different formats over the different parts. And if you're listening to this and you're thinking, that's crazy and it's way too much overhead and it doesn't make any sense, I agree. That was what I was thinking at first, but it's actually exactly what happens with Nginx and with Apache and
the
all
PHP
those.
mod as well, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And when you measure performances of all that chain of transformation, you have only an overhead of less than 1 millisecond, which makes sense because that's what happens already on so many servers in the world. It's just that Bref does the conversion in PHP but yeah, it's only less than 1 millisecond. So you can run Symfony or Laravel with the same performances on Lambda that you can on any server. So you don't have to really care about the fact that it's going through several different formats.
So were you familiar with fast CGI before, or did you just get your hands on Aws Lambda and thought, I want to write PHP code and how do I get it working? How did it start?
Yeah. I learned a lot about HTTP, about fast CGI, about the whole ecosystem of even dealing with headers and sessions. I mean, I knew about headers and how cookies were sent and sessions and stuff like that, but when you have to fix stuff that is related to HTTP headers and it gets really complex real fast. And the first version of Bref, it wasn't that, I would say, that complex. First version of Bref, what I did is that I created a simple PHP class that would take the API gateway, the Lambda event, and turn it directly into a Symfony request or a Laravel request or a PSR7 request, like immediately without having a fast CGI request. So it was just a little bit faster, even though it's not really noticeable. And to me, it made sense because you have less, transformation. And that worked quite well, except that, it's always the little details that kill the whole thing. And when you actually run stuff in production and you have frameworks expecting to get the header function working, to get $get and $post and headers in specific arrays, and it all falls apart with those little details. So running PHP FPM on Lambda was the way to make it work from A to Z, and it was just working.
Okay, so I imagine that those little bits of the PHP server API are quite tricky sometimes and quite messy. So
fortunately, I did use a library for the fast CGI connection and protocol, and it's really well made and well maintained. I couldn't say the name because I forgot half of it, and the other part is, I think it's German, it's a really complex name, so I won't try to say it. But really great stuff from an open source contributor, so I just want to say thanks for his work. Really great stuff, and without that, wouldn't have been possible.
I think
it's the fast CGI client.
Yeah, is it maybe Holger Woltersdorf? I think
Yes, I think.
that's him.
Yes.
Yeah, I saw the library before, and he's quite active on it and
Hmm.
tweets about the releases. So this is how I saw it. Um, so final question before we start with the second part. Um, as a developer, and I see you talking about serverless tonight, and I want to get my hands on serverless and Lambda and Bref. How do I start?
Mhm. So I really recommend that you start with the simplest part. Like you, so if you're using Laravel or Symfony, first you need to know that there are specific documentations and bridges for your framework. So I would say go to bref.sh, that's the website, open the documentation, read the introduction, and have a look at the documentation for your framework. Usually with Symfony or Laravel, it's like you install Laravel, then you install the Bref bridge for Laravel, and it will automatically configure Laravel to run on Lambda. And then you have a command which is bref init that will create for you a configuration file. And that file is configuring how your code will run on Lambda. So it's creating API gateway for you with the URL, it's creating the Lambda function for you, it's creating the permissions correctly for you. So whenever I say you have to use API gateway and that's and that and that, actually to get started, you just install the default config file and you run serverless deploy, and that will be deployed and available online. So getting started, I think you take the example that exists and just deploy very basic stuff. Then, if you're really into it and you enjoy it and you want to create like crazy microservices and stuff, you can have a look deeper at the documentation, have a look at the second runtime, which is more advanced, and then have fun. That's where the fun begins. But you can start just using Lambda as web hosting. And there's no shame in doing that for just web hosting because it's really good web hosting. And I know AWS doesn't like that, um, but it's really good web hosting. Don't have to use all the features.
And the AWS free tier covers everything for a start, right?
It covers everything except for the database. Even though you have a free tier that covers the database as well, a specific small database. But yeah, you have a very large free tier if you're talking about Lambda. It's a very large free tier. It's like 1 million requests per month.
Per month.
So
Okay.
yeah, no, and even if you go over that, you will, if you pay more than a few euros per month on Lambda, honestly, congrats, because you have a very, very popular website.
Okay. Awesome. So thanks for the insights on that already. And I would like to hand over to Dennis.
All right. In that case, I will share my screen because now it's quiz time. And oh, I hope this is the right one. This looks good. I switched my browser, so now I have to confirm all those things again. Just a second. By the way, you forgot to mention one more resource for getting into serverless, and that is serverless visually explained. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I will do that. Yeah, that's a really good point. So I work on the Bref documentation, which is related to PHP, which is related to how do I get my frameworks on Lambda. But I also work on the course. So the course is available online. It's a paid course if you're curious about that. And in the course, I try to cover the basic stuff of running websites and web applications, but also the more advanced stuff about how to write queue workers, how to write microservices that talk to each other, how to process files on Lambda, and different use cases and usage pattern that you can have. I also try to cover databases and actually more content that was able to contribute for free in the Bref documentation. So I kind of have those two resources. And if you're curious, yeah, the name is Serverless Visually Explained. So serverlessvisuallyexplained.com. And you can have a look at that. I try to build also nice animations to explain how Lambda scales and how you have the cold starts and how you can build scalable applications. So you can check it out.
All right, perfect cue, because now I got the quiz running. Can you see the screen?
Yep.
All right, in that case, I will reload, and it's just a quick round of questions. So let's start with macOS, Linux, or Windows?
Well, I do use macOS, but I don't judge. Anyone can use whatever they want. I know there's a lot of wars online, and I don't care. Use whatever you want. So yeah, macOS for me.
Maybe a quick question, even though it's not on the screen.
Yeah.
How about Bref? Does it work better, or does it have issues with Windows? But I guess that's the standard thing, that you have issues with Windows.
That's usually when I get an issue and it's about Windows, I get I get sweaty. I'm like, oh my god, I want to. I don't know. I don't know how to help. I can't really reproduce it, and it's hard to debug. But fortunately, I don't have that many on Windows. I don't think on Bref at least. I think that's okay. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Next one: JSON, XML, or YAML?
Honestly, that's a hard one because I know there's a lot of hate about YAML, but I also like how simple it is, as long as you don't mess an indentation, right?
Yes.
And and then XML is awesome because you can type and have autocompletion and everything, but XML is hard to type, so I'm not sure. I would say I will say YAML.
All right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Twitter or Reddit?
I do love both. I also hate both on some aspects. Really hard questions, honestly. I will go with Twitter. Yeah, because you can talk to people that you can interact with for a long time. You know about them. It's really, I enjoy that.
All right. Then what? Vardamp or Xdebug?
So I will say Xdebug. Of course, I never use Vardamp, right? I didn't use it just yesterday.
No.
Nobody does that.
Well, actually, maybe a good question. How does Xdebug work in a serverless context? Well, you just connect to it anyway. It's just like connecting to like Docker image or anything. It's probably not that different.
It's not that different, but if you are debugging a web request, the web request must stop after 30 seconds. So it's not really usable with Xdebug because if you stop the execution, then you have like 20 seconds to debug. You have to be real quick. So yeah, that's that. Unfortunately, that's something that you can't really use on Lambda. I mean, it's not great.
Okay.
Mhm.
But yeah, maybe in the future something comes up. I know that Derek is working with Xbug Cloud. Maybe
Yeah,
he can. That's something that makes it work a little bit better.
I would love to see something like that. Yeah, and in other languages, they have really advanced profiling and debugging tools. And in PHP, it's lacking a little bit, so that would be really, really interesting.
All right, so that's it with the short questions. And maybe since we talked about serverless and Bref in general, let's get into Bref 1.0 and what led up to this. So can you maybe start, how was the inception of Bref in the beginning? What wasn't there maybe that is now in 1.0 that got you started?
So if we go back to the real beginning, which is something I don't think you can find that online, but when I got started, and if you try to get started with AWS Lambda and you don't follow the Bref documentation, what you will want to do is go into the AWS console and click to create your function. That's a terrible way to get started because the AWS console is terrible. So use a proper tool. I will highly recommend that. Anyway, that's what I did 3 and something years ago. I went into the console, created my Lambda function, and then went and clicked like 100 times to create a URL for my function, and it was working. So I figured I will create an open source project that does all of that for me. And that involved calling the AWS API. So that was like Bref 0.1 or something. Calling the AWS API, creating Lambda functions and automating the creation of API gateway. And I think it was maybe 30, 40 API calls just to get a URL and a single Lambda function. And there were so many things to do. It was so complex, not because, I mean, just to create a Lambda function. And it was so complex that the AWS API was throttling me because I was doing too many API calls. And so I figured that I'm not doing this right. I was very new with AWS and I was completely demoralized by the effort I had to do. So that's where I discovered the serverless framework, which is an open source tool that takes a YAML file. So that's the one that you will have with Bref, serverless.yaml. You configure, I want a Lambda function, I want a public URL, I want those environment variables, and I want, I don't know, like I don't want to deploy the node module directory, for example. You can set that up. And it takes that YAML file and it deploys and configure your Lambda functions and everything that goes with it. So it's called infrastructure as code. And if you've used Terraform, Chef, Puppet, CloudFormation, all those tools are the same thing. It's the same principle, is to configure things online. So yeah, at the time I discovered the serverless framework and I realized they implemented all I did already. So I can build, and that's how I started Bref 0.2, I think. I built upon the serverless framework to provide only the layer specific to PHP. That way I had less work to do. And then over time, Bref 0.3, I switched from the serverless framework to SAM, which is the official configuration format. It's also YAML from AWS and specific for serverless applications. So on the paper, it seemed like a better alternative. It's like official, it's, yeah, better alternative. But it turns out it was more complex and it was less up to date. And it was harder to use. So Bref 0.4, or I think 0.4, yeah, I switched back to serverless.yaml. So that's why today, and it's still the case today, if you use Bref, you are actually using the serverless framework with the Bref runtime. So that's why I say Bref is an open source project that contains the Bref runtime for Lambda and tooling and integrations for frameworks, but also like it makes some choices for you to get you started. If you start from scratch, you have so many things to choose from, and with Bref you can get started more easily.
And by the time that you switched from serverless to the other
SAM?
approach and to
Yep.
SAM, okay, was it already a popular project? So did you already have many users, and how did they react to that change and then to the change back, obviously?
Yeah, it wasn't that popular. I had a few companies, also people that I knew that were using it. It was labeled as experimental, and I mean, people understood. I tried really to explain the choice. I was actually I opened an issue and compared the two projects, pros and cons, what was missing. I think something big was missing in serverless at the time, and it was in SAM. So that was the main justification for going with SAM. And then serverless got much simpler then, and I went back with serverless. So the move back to serverless is, I think, the moment Bref 0.4 was the moment that Bref started to get some users, some real users. But at the time, Bref was still running, and I did not mention that, the early version of Bref were not running as custom runtimes for Lambda. So when I say custom runtime, it's a way of AWS, like AWS is saying, PHP is not supported, but you can bring support for PHP, and it's officially supported. But before that, for years, custom runtimes did not exist. So Bref was implemented as a JavaScript bridge. So it was basically JavaScript receiving the event and then executing PHP, like a embedded PHP binary, which would then run your application. So it was so many layers more, And the funny thing is, it was very weird, but it was running. And it was running in production for some companies, and it was just saving so much money for some companies, And I remember I did some talks at the time, like, oh yeah, this is awesome, you can run PHP on Lambda, you have to use a JavaScript bridge. And everybody was like, what? That doesn't make any sense. But it works. and it's saves money, it solves problems, and it just works. It's stable. What can I say? Fortunately, 2 years ago, in November 2018, AWS released, they announced and released the custom runtime. And then I got to work, and I think that was Bref 0.5. That was the most important release of Bref, I think, because that's when people stopped thinking about the JavaScript thing inside Lambda. And they were like, okay, now PHP is running properly inside Lambda, and that's a more serious project. We also took the time in Brave 0.5 at the time to compare the different ways of running PHP. So that's when I started using PHP FPM on Lambda. I did a lot of benchmarks, tried different approaches like forking PHP in memory, using threads, using so many weird stuff. I even like I forked the PHP FPM code base in C. I don't do C, I don't know about C, but I forked the code base and changed a few things and made it work in a special way for Lambda. And I still think that's a really, really interesting thing that could be added to PHP. But yeah. But we ended up settling with PHP FPM because it just works with frameworks. So that was, yeah, I think that was a good decision at the time. And that was Brave 0.5.
All right, and by that time you already got a user base with. You already said that companies were using it. The community was picking up. How did that change your approach when working with Brefs or when developing Bref? Did you get more input that you had to or that you wanted to put into the project? How did you deal with bugs that came up? And maybe you already mentioned that Windows bugs are difficult because you don't have the environment to run. So how did that affect your work on Bref when it took off?
Mm. Yeah, Brave 0.5 was really that's where it started to grow and attract more users, and that's where it started to be more serious because larger companies were using it. Like I heard about a website running 40 billion pages per day, and I was like, "What the fuck? How is this even possible?" And yeah, they're just happy with it. They saved so much money by using EC2 and containers, and then Lambda, and it just works. So I started to have um, all those users, and it was a little bit of pressure. I have some other open source projects, but without other open source projects, you can have a lot of tests and be confident and have code reviews and stuff like this. But with Bref, it's a bit different because, yeah, there are a lot of tests with the Bref code base, but you're also depending on, yeah, do you know enough? Have you read enough documentation on the AWS format for, API gateway, or how do you send cookies back to API gateway? Because there's API gateway V1 and V2, and there's this mode and this mode, and you have to take so much time to explore all the cases, and that's where it got, yeah, honestly, it got difficult for me to be able to say I will add support for cookies because there was something very specific with cookies. And if I want to do that, I need to support like 5, 6 different use cases, different configurations that were possible for users. And I don't even use 5 of them, just one. And so that's where it got really hard. Basically, if you wanted to add a feature, even like merging a pull request, I would have to test that and take like an afternoon to test it over different configurations, sometimes even starting up databases or servers that would cost me money to handle all of that. So that's where it got complex, and I got started with the project of Bref is going to be something bigger than what I had before in terms of open source projects. So I want that to happen. So I need to build something around Bref to make that possible, like consulting, training, and that's how I got started with a few different services, because I knew that couldn't only be I work an hour every week, because I do that for fun. No, it's actually used by companies, and it's a bit different.
And so with all that time you have to invest in like developing the features or looking at pull requests, how much time of your workday is spent on Bref, and how much is spent on, for example, the consulting work and other projects?
I try to have about 1 day every week for open source. And when I say for open source, it's mostly about Bref and serverless related topics like Bref related projects. In practice, it's between half a day or a whole day each week. And it's not nearly enough. There are so many issues and pull requests I need to respond to or support requests, and it's really, really hard.
I can imagine.
Yeah, and what's even harder for me is that, so as you mentioned, I got more contributions, and there are basically two kind of contributions. Um, eh, there are contributions where someone will get involved, and they will basically deal with something. They can be in charge of that, and that's amazing. There are very few contributors like that because I guess most people, and I understand that they build the feature that they need, and then it's not really they are not paid for that. It's not their life project. They don't really care about that much. So yeah, the other kind of contribution is a pull request, and then you have to test it, and you have to understand it, and you have to own it, because that will be your job to maintain it in the future. So that's why it's really hard to have pull requests like that, and they're like 80% good, but you're not 100% convinced, and you have to make it your own code and your own problem, and it's really hard because yeah, then you have to make a choice, which I'm terrible at doing. Like, do I refuse that and I explain it, or do I try to fix it, or do I leave it open and hope that maybe next week I will have time to do something better? And that's usually what I do. But yeah, I just want to take the time also to acknowledge the fact that there are some contributors that do huge work, like Tobias Nyholm, that is handling. So he has taken over the extensions, PHP extensions for Bref. So let's say you want to use GD or Imagic or any PHP extension with Bref, you can easily install them thanks to Tobias's work in the Bref organization on GitHub. So there's the Bref extra extension project. So he's, like I said, he's managing all of that, and that's really, really great. And I hope he enjoys it, because that's really a lot of work. Same, I had Sébastien Houzé, who's helped a lot with the Bref 1.0 release, like doing a lot of stuff in Docker files and compiling PHP, cleaning all that up. It wasn't just, oh, I need this, I will add a line or two here and hope that it will not break anything for anyone else. But it was more like, okay, let me explain and refactor and make it proper so that we can better maintain it in the future. And that was a really, really great contribution.
And you also mentioned that there are bridges for Laravel and for Symfony, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Do you maintain them also yourself, or is it contributors?
It's a bit of a mix. I basically maintain them, but things could be much, much better. With the Laravel bridge, I think I'm okay, because I use it. I understand completely how it works. So I'm fairly happy with that, even though I know there are major changes that we could do to make it much better. But those are like in the to-do list for later, if I have time, if someone else has the time, if the company wants to sponsor that. But with a Symfony bridge, it's a bit harder, because it relies a lot on the Symfony internal implementation. So I did some part of it like 6 months ago or a year ago, I think. But Symfony changes over the versions, and it's hard to keep up with that. Follow the Symfony internals and keep up with the bridge. And I don't use it that much. I do use it on some projects, but not that much. And so it's harder to keep track of that and to keep it updated. And I do get some contributions, but often those are very topical contributions. Like, they change the project in a specific direction, and I'm not sure if that's the right thing to do. And yeah, I think I could use on the Symfony bridge like a more long-term vision, someone that could steer that project.
Right. Yeah, maybe since I mean, especially with Bref 1.0, I guess the user base will pick up even more because now the API is stable,
Yeah.
and so maybe that will drive more contributions and also contributions that stay longer and basically are more involved, as you mentioned. Um,
Yeah,
yeah. So,
sorry, I just want to say that the Bref 1.0 wasn't really a major change compared to Bref 0.5, but it was mostly about sending a message like Bref is running in production for so many companies. It's stable. Uh, it was 0 point something for a long time, but there is no longer a reason for that. We did change a few things in the internal implementation that were breaking backward compatibility for small details. The upgrade was quite easy, but yeah, it was mostly a question of yeah, saying that's fine. And now you can use Bref. It's a very stable thing.
all right, that was what I was going to ask. But
Mhm.
then maybe the onto the next question: are you already planning a Bref 2.0, or what would there need to be for you to consider working on a 2.0?
I'm not planning. No, I'm not at the moment. I really want to build, continue to build trust. I don't have many things that I want to break. I think the reason for a big change could be um, possibly like splitting those two runtimes that I mentioned. You know, I have to explain that there are two ways to run PHP on Lambda, like the AWS way and the web hosting way with Bref and PHP FPM. And so that maybe could be clearer by splitting those two in just having two different names. You know, there's like Bref and there's some things. Maybe that could help, but it's mostly about teaching and communication, not really technical stuff. There are features that we could add in Bref, but I think the main things that we could add, and I'm working on those things whenever I get time, but those things are about the whole environment on top of Bref. So yeah, you can run PHP, and if you're using the FPM layer, you can have Laravel or Symfony, and all is fine. But if you want to use the functions and write very small microservices and micro functions in an advanced way, then you could very well use a library for using queues more easily. Or I'm working also on a small micro framework specifically for Lambda. All those things that are very specific and that could go in separated projects. So I think those are the main things where Bref will continue to evolve, and Bref itself is very stable at the moment. So we have mostly bug fixes and a few uh, helpers and tools that we are adding.
All right. Let me check. I have to. Sorry, I had to look at the list, but I was just listening. So you already mentioned that basically there's a lot of work that is basically on your side. There are a few contributors, so maybe you can help people get into a Bref, or what by what maybe other way to phrase it. How could I get started helping you? You already mentioned the Symphony Bridge might be a good way to start for someone who knows Symphony. What other things
Mhm.
are there?
I think the best way to have someone, and I'm talking from experience myself, the best way to have someone get involved with open source is to work on something they care about. Um, and if you do work with Symfony, either your company or yourself, you're just a fan and want to improve support in Bref, then yeah, working on that Symfony bridge could be a very good topic. There's the Laravel bridge as well. There are different topics like that that could be um, very interesting. If you want to get started, so I'm saying that to anyone listening, and if you want to get started and get involved in a specific topic for I'm not saying a long time, but for a while, then feel free to get in touch with me. I'm really happy to take a few hours to explain how Bref works, how we can help, how you can implement your solution. Um, I just don't offer that and don't do that for everyone because most contributions are about specific feature. But some people want to get involved in a longer time, and I like to create uh, you know long-term exchanges and get I like to delegate some parts. That's perfectly fine for me.
All right. Since I think there are not there's a long chat going on, but no questions. So maybe that's a good point to start. Like, if you have any questions around Bref, around serverless, feel free to write them. And yeah, maybe Christopher, do you have?
Yes, I do have another question. So you mentioned that there is Tobias Nyholm helping out with contributing, that Holger with his PHP FPM layer helps out, and there you're relying on serverless as a framework as well. Um,
Yeah.
but I think Dennis mentioned serverless visually explained, and I know you have a newsletter as well. So is there another way besides contributing to Bref or contributing to the ecosystem of Bref in supporting Bref and your work?
Mhm. So I realized that I wasn't really exhaustive when I answered the previous question about contributing at large to the project. A good way to contribute is to have a look at the documentation. If you see something that isn't that is confusing, you can open a pull request. Changes, small changes on the documentation are the best because you can get that merged immediately. That's really nice way to help people. Even a typo fix, it's really great. I love those merge requests. You can also share about your project, like writing a blog post about what you've tried, about how you're using Brave or Lambda at your company or for your personal project. Those are really great because I talk a lot about serverless, but I talk sometimes maybe things that are too complex or not really appropriate for some specific communities, not appropriate for some specific framework. So if you have some knowledge about something, share it. It's really a great way to contribute to the community in general. Um, you can also help people, like come in the chat. We have a Slack. You can help and chat with people, ask questions, of course, but you can answer some questions. And there's a really great community in Slack. I really love chatting with people there. And finally, to support the project in general, so there's the course, which is a paid course, as I mentioned, that helps me indeed write more content for on my blog, on the Bref documentation, add some features. You can also sponsor the project. So you can sponsor me directly on GitHub, or ask your boss. Mostly I ask people to have companies sponsor people instead of having people put their own money into sponsoring. I think that's better if companies do the sponsoring.
Sure.
But also you can support Tobias, who's working on the extensions. You can support other contributors of Bref, because there are many people, like I think we passed 100 contributors on Bref, so there are many people that you can support around the project. And finally, if you want to get started with Brave and serverless, or if you have started and you want support, then I also sell like a support plan, and that's a great way for me to help companies and teams go serverless, but also that allows me to spend more time working on the project, like fixing the bugs you are having. I know that I can fix them because I can ask for some details and we can chat, and that's a great way as well to make the project go forward.
Yeah, that sounds like a very fair idea. In the chat there is a few things going on. One, no questions yet, but sounds interesting. Heard about for the first time, so that's someone who will dig into it, I guess. And there is a thanks as well for the great course, Serverless Visually Explained. And,
I can
Great,
second
thanks.
that. I really enjoy that course.
Okay, you're a reader.
Yeah, I bought it when it came out, and the small animations to basically showcase what is happening, where you can click the buttons and see it in action. That's the visually part is really appealing.
Yeah, I had a
And
lot
it
of
works
fun.
so well with the online format. If you don't have a book, that is a great idea.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun building that. At first, I built the animation in TypeScript for conferences, for trainings. I was using the simulator live, and then over time, I thought, okay, I might add that to a book, but how do I do that? And then I figured, okay, I can build the whole thing in HTML and JavaScript, and that's how I got started with that.
and the last one, I think that's more Symfony related, is Um, the main problem with Symfony is file system related, especially with the cache, which partly written at runtime. Am I wrong? Um, I know you worked on separating cache tier and build tier, and that's great first step, but it will take time for the ecosystem to leverage it.
Yeah, that's a very, very, very good point. Um, Symfony was really hard to get running properly, and I'm not 100% happy still with the situation. I mean, it works just fine. I've just helped a client. We've built a back office and website on Lambda with the bridge, and it just works. So it was just perfect, but it's not as perfect as it could be. So Thibaut is saying that there is a new feature in Symfony 5.2 where, as I mentioned, the file system is read-only. So what do you do with the cache? So now in Symfony, you have like kind of two caches. You have the cache that is written when you deploy. So it's called the build cache now. It's like the compiled container and that stuff that you generate once and then you never change it. So that thing, you can generate that before deploying. And then when it's on Lambda, that's fine because Symfony will never try to overwrite it. It's written, it's here. And then there's the second part of the cache, which is the cache that changes, like database cache or in-memory cache, or application cache, stuff that can change. And that kind of cache, you have to put it elsewhere. So when I said before that the file system is read-only, I kind of lied a little bit because you can actually write stuff in the temporary directory on Lambda. And that's something that you usually don't use except for caching. So Symfony cache would be perfect in that temporary directory. But as Thibaut said, the question is stemming from the fact that the documentation isn't perfect, isn't up to date with the last Symfony version, and also not everybody is on Symfony 5.2. And that's the kind of things I would love to spend an afternoon like trying it out, making sure that that's the correct way to do it, and then documenting it once and for all, and everybody can use it. But that's just another thing on my to-do list. So hopefully someone can maybe take that up and do the proper Symfony way someday.
All right, thanks. There was for a short time a question about, yeah, I think it's back again. Have you tried running compiled frameworks such as Falcon PHP with Bref and Lambda?
I haven't. I'm not sure that anyone has built the Falcon PHP extension for Lambda yet. I haven't. I have seen people ask for it, but I've never seen anyone actually use it. And I think in theory it should work as long as it's not writing into the code directory. But also maybe that's a good way to talk about Docker support in Lambda. So it's very recent. It's like since December, Lambda they added a new feature in Lambda, and you can now deploy Docker containers on Lambda. And that's interesting because basically, if you manage to make Falcon PHP work in Docker, then it will work on Lambda. That's the theory. Again, you have to sometimes change some details, but in theory, it should work as long as it's not doing something completely crazy. But I think Falcon is not like I'm thinking about React PHP or asynchronous frameworks. Those are different things, and those are not really made for Lambda. So Falcon PHP, I think it should work if you have time to make it work. That's a bit of effort, I think.
All right. So I guess we're coming to an end here. It was very, very interesting having you as a guest and talking about Bref. I think we learned a lot about this topic today. Dennis, do you have a final note, or Matthieu, do you have a final note?
I don't. I just want to say thank you. That we got very technical in some parts. I hope that we didn't lose too many people in the chat. But yeah, that was fun to go over some details that I think I never mentioned in the years. It was like very old details in Bref that was fun to remember that.
That's great. And I think there is no public announcement about the next episode out now, until now. We're going to cover releases, of course, in the next weeks and months, something like maybe PHP Unit 10 or something similar. But we keep you up to date on Twitter, so follow us, and thanks for joining in tonight. Thanks and goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye. Wait, I don't find my mouse cursor. There it is. All right, the